Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today I'm going to show you how to set up a course if you wanted to do that for your web page. So obviously I'm going to select the video option, just selecting out of the pre-made template, and I'm just going to call it course. And as you can see, it immediately updates on the top header, so I can just drag it, updates. Now it's on the right hand side. And then if I go into the course, you can see we've got various chapters, obviously all video based, as I said, and you can go in and change how you want to do them. So you've got each individual section there ready to go. You can give it a title, you can give it a description, thumbnail, and then of course the next category, the video itself, what video you want to put in. And then if you want to work on it, you don't have to release it immediately. You can have it published later on. You can add additional modules. You can see one's just popped up right there immediately. So very easy to customize, assuming you've got the content all there ready to go. But if you don't want to do a free course, if perhaps you want to monetize it, then, well, there's a selling section there. Just go in and set it up, and there's a very simple menu, how much you want to sell it for, what restrictions you want to put on it. And once you've set that all up, you'll be ready to go with your course on your website. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. A question that is sometimes asked is, what was the Marine Nationale actually doing during the early part of World War II? The answer is actually quite a lot, and while the overall activities of the Marine Nationale during this period are the subject for a larger video, today we're going to briefly cover one particular aspect of things, namely what the most modern fast capital ships of the French Navy were doing and why they were so important to Allied plans. So, speaking in purely naval terms, the Anglo-French alliance prior to World War II made a huge amount of sense. Both nations had anticipated possible hostilities with one or two other countries from a short list that consisted of Germany, Italy, and Japan. But thanks to the Washington Naval Treaty and the subsequent London Naval Treaties, even the Royal Navy would be stretched to hold off one of the European navies while committing enough forces to deal with the Japanese Navy, or commit enough forces to crush the Kriegsmarine or the Regia Marina while holding off the Imperial Japanese Navy. Fighting Germany and Italy combined while Japan sat things out would be much easier, but of course you had to prepare for a reasonable worst-case scenario. From the Marine Nationale's perspective, by 1939 they were entering a bit of a difficult period. Although they did have a number of older, slower battleships, primarily the Britannias, but technically some of the Corbett's could be brought up as well, they only had 2 fast units, and the Germans had just commissioned the Scharnhorsts, which along with the Deutschlands meant that there were 5 relatively swift hulls that could cause problems. The Italians, at that point, had just modernised 2 capital ships, the Cavours, and they had entered service. But the Dorias were mostly done with their modernisation, and the first 2 Littorio class were also due to complete the following year. That would give the Regia Marina 6 fast capital ships in 1940, against which the Marine Nationale would have just the 2 Dunkirks and might be able to just about get Richelieu into service at around the same time as the Littorios, which would give the Italians a 2-to-1 advantage purely by hull numbers, unless they deigned to slow down enough for the Britannias to get involved. Fighting the Imperial Japanese Navy alone over French Indochina was out of the question. The Japanese Navy was far too large and powerful. But, in combination with the Royal Navy, most of these issues could be resolved thanks to the latter's greater size, especially when it came to dealing with Japan or containing Germany, the latter in part thanks to the UK's natural geographical position, which would allow them to choke off the Channel and the North Sea far better than the Marine Nationale could, although they did have the other half of the Channel. But this arrangement wasn't all one way, purely to the Marine Nationale's benefit. The Royal Navy stood to gain a fair bit as well. As they contemplated the shape of things in 1939, in terms of true fast capital ships, their potential list of enemies added up to a mixture of any two of the two Germans, the Scharnhorsts, two Italians, the Cavours, and 4 Japanese ships, the Congos. Although the Nagatas were a little bit faster than average, the Queen Elizabeths were about equally as quick. On top of all this, there were, of course, the Deutschlands, of which there were 3, and potentially a trio of 12-inch armed supercruisers, which intelligence suggested the Imperial Japanese Navy might be building. In 1939, to counter this, although the Royal Navy as a whole was quite large, they only actually had 3 fast capital ships of their own, Renown, Repulse and Hood. The forecast didn't seem to be much better, as the Dorias and Littorios plus one of the Bismarcks would complete the following year, 1940, and the British would only have King George V as an additional fast capital ship to counter them. 1941 did look a little bit better, as that would only add Tirpitz to the potential German and Italian ships, but it would see Prince of Wales and Duke of York hoist the White Ensign. But if you assumed a worst-case scenario in terms of fast capital ship hull numbers, and that was fighting the Italians and Japanese under reasonable circumstances, this meant that in 1939, the fast capital ship odds were 6-3 against. By 1940, they'd be 10-4, and by 1941, they'd be 11-6, not counting supercruisers, Panzerschiff, and whatever the Japanese might be building in terms of oversized fast battleships themselves. Now, of course, this did leave out the dozen older British capital ships, and the Royal Navy did think that at least Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, Nelson and Rodney could pretty much stand up to anything the potential Axis could throw at them, although the latter two Queen Elizabeths were still in the middle of modernisation and refit themselves. And the remaining ships, Bar and Malaya and the R-class, would at least be force multipliers. But, again, in a reasonable worst-case scenario, enemy fast capital ships could simply decline to be engaged by the slower battleships unless they were in turn tied to some kind of fixed or slow-moving objective, such as an attack on their ports or a troop convoy that was being escorted, or if they could be slowed down by aircraft carrier strikes. But that, of course, was a bit of a roll of the dice, even if the weather was clement. But combining the Royal Navy and Marine Nationale's efforts made the picture look significantly better. This would give odds, again assuming an Italy-Japan war scenario, of 6-5 in 1939, 10-7 in 1940, and 11-10 in 1941. So although 1940 still looked a little bit wobbly, the odds otherwise were thus overall close enough that technical deficiencies perceived by Allied intelligence in some of the potential enemy vessels, such as the relatively speaking weak guns of the Scharnhorsts and the Italian refits, or the relative lack of armour on the Congos, might just even things up in the fast capital ship department. And then if you factored in the 16 older battleships of the Anglo-French fleet and their 7 aircraft carriers, with 6 more already under construction, the picture started to look a little bit more in their favour. Nonetheless, when war was declared in September 1939, although there were 5 Allied fast capital ships, Renown, Repulse, Hood, Dunkirk and Strasbourg, up against just 2 Germans, the Scharnhorsts, there were also the 3 Deutschlands, which ideally needed a heavy hand to deal with them, and there was the potential threat of Italy getting involved at some point. Although this scenario wasn't ideal, it was at least not the worst case that they'd thought of pre-war, which was Japan getting involved with at least one other European power, as at this stage the Japanese seemed to be mostly happy beating up on the Chinese. But there was an additional problem with the potential 5 fast German assets with big guns, and that was that since Germany was the naval power on the defensive, at least in terms of surface warfare, the Germans could choose to send out their ships when they wanted, at a point of maximum ship availability, for instance, whereas the Allies had to keep their 5 fast ships operational and potentially at sea almost constantly, as they had to be ready to deal with the Kriegsmarine vessels whenever they might happen to sail. Now, of course, aerial reconnaissance and intelligence reports could help lessen the stress in this department somewhat, but it was physically impossible to operate all 5 ships constantly at once, as at any given time, there would be a need for refits, refueling, and so on and so forth, potentially also later on battle damage repair, and that would reduce the availability of these vessels somewhat. So what this all amounted to was a split of work. The British battle cruisers were, at the start of the conflict, all in the Home Fleet's battle cruiser squadron, and so it was agreed that they would try to guard the North Sea, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, and the northernmost parts of the North Atlantic, ideally catching German raiders before they managed to get too far and do too much damage. But if that failed, it would be up to the Marine Nationale to take over in the mid and southern Atlantic regions with the Dunkirks to deal with the threat. This, of course, like most plans, would not entirely survive first contact with the enemy, but it was a good idea in principle, and was the foundation behind the formation that we're going to be looking at today, the Force de Raid. Now, it should not be imagined that this was simply the Marine Nationale becoming some ancillary to the Royal Navy to protect British shipping. 80% of French imports also came by sea, mostly into their Atlantic coastal ports, and with war against Germany, not only was that land-based importing border somewhat curtailed, but imports of war material from overseas, particularly the USA, would obviously be even more important, and so this was a joint plan with joint benefits. While the rest of the Marine Nationale, from the Bretagne-class battleships all the way down to the smaller submarines and trawlers, were getting on with quite a lot of other work, the Force de Raid was assembled in Brest. This initially consisted of the Dunkirk and Strasbourg, plus the 3 modern light cruisers of the 4th Cruiser Division, the Georges Legueux, Montcalm, and Gloire. In addition, where range or the opportunity for nearby refueling ports allowed, there were also 8 of the largest, fastest, and most powerful destroyers in the Marine Nationale, the 2 Mogadors and the 6 Le Fantasques assigned. This force actually sailed the evening before war was formally declared, as the Royal Navy had informed the Marine Nationale that the Panzerschiff Deutschland and her sister ship Graf Spee were already at sea, although when the French were subsequently informed that it was believed the raiders hadn't yet entered the Atlantic, the force returned home to await further news, picking up the liner Flandre, which had been sheltering in the Azores on the way home. In fact, although the Deutschland had technically not quite breached the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap at that point, Graf Spee was actually already well into the Atlantic and heading further south. Now, at this stage, although notionally on the roster for a combined sailing in strength, the Force de Raid would in practice now be broken up into smaller forces to try and cover a wider area. Strasbourg was assigned the heavy cruisers Algerie and Dupleix from the Mediterranean, plus the carrier HMS Hermes, and became Force X, while Dunkirk retrained the 3 light cruisers and was also assigned the carrier Bern to become Force L. In both cases, the slower carriers were quickly found to actually hinder the overall maximum speed of the groups, and although their aircraft could expand the group's search radius quite significantly, and in theory at least the carriers could be left behind with perhaps a single escort while the capital ships and the rest of the cruisers headed off to kill whatever they had spotted, it was very quickly decided that at best the carriers should operate as an ancillary supporting force rather than directly with the fast capital ships. Along with 3 of the Le Fantasque class destroyers, Force X, that's the one with Strasbourg, would base itself at Dakar after some initial thought being given to basing it in Jamaica, while Force L would remain in Brest during October and November 1939. Force X and its associated supporting craft would undertake patrols in the area around Dakar, and they managed to capture 2 German cargo ships, the Santa Fe and the Chemnitz, as well as forcing another, the Halle, to scuttle itself, before the force was recalled home at the end of November after other vessels arrived to take over this position. Force L, meanwhile, had helped first to escort convoy KJ-3 before joining HMS Hood in a sweep that was aiming to find the Scharnhorsts, which had just attacked and sunk the armed merchant cruiser HMS Rawalpindi. Heavy storms, however, slowed the force down as Dunkirk's lightly built bow took something of a battering, giving the Germans a chance to slip away, and Dunkirk had to head home for some quick repairs. After that, British and French interests would coincide. The British asked for Dunkirk to assist HMS Revenge with the escort of convoy TC2, which was made up of 7 valuable, fully loaded troop ships. This happened to dovetail quite nicely with the French government moving France's gold deposits, and so Dunkirk would take 100 tons of gold over to Canada, then turn around and help bring Canadian troops over to Europe. Outside of the capital ship sweeps and operations, the destroyers that were assigned to the now somewhat dispersed Force de Raid also helped to bring a number of convoys safely into port over the U-boat-infested waters of the Eastern Atlantic. But as 1939 turned into 1940, the situation was changing. The Graf Spee had been sunk, the Deutschland and the Scharnhorst had headed home, where the former had been renamed to Lutzow, and the Italians were looking more and more belligerent. As a result, it was decided to reform the Force de Raid, expand it, and relocate it to primarily Mers el-Kebir and secondly to the ports of Oran and Algiers, with the intention of thus still being able to counter German raiders in case the Admiral Scheer or one of the Hipper class made a break for it, but equally they were close enough to be able to dash into the Western Mediterranean to deal with the Regia Marina as and when Mussolini finally made his intentions clear. For this purpose, the Force de Raid was now to be part of a larger Flotte de Atlantique, with the Force de Raid being the primary component, now made up of the original 2 capital ships, Dunkirk and Strasbourg, 3 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, but with the other 3 La Galissonière class light cruisers added to them, plus the 2nd squadron, which was made up of the older battleships Provence and Bretagne, and the destroyers Tigre and Lynx. The intention being mostly to use the faster ships of the 1st squadron, but with the slower, heavier ships available as backup just in case something really big went down. Although it would take some weeks for the latter vessels to arrive in Mers el-Kebir, as they had originally been stationed in the eastern Mediterranean. It seemed almost immediately, though, that the whole thing would be upended once again, as less than a week after arriving at Mers el-Kebir at the start of April 1940, the fast ships were recalled back to Brest to help escort troops and supplies for the upcoming Norwegian theatre of operations. But no sooner had they shown up back in homeland France than Italy got still more belligerent, and so most of the force was sent back to Mers el-Kebir once again, minus a couple of destroyers and the cruiser Montcalm, which remained behind for a couple of weeks in case they were needed. Italy then entered the war in early June, and the force was now, luckily, at maximum strength. The capital ships based at Mers el-Kebir with a few escorts, and the bulk of the cruisers and destroyers just up the coast at Oran and Algiers. The Force de Raid would sortie again, although unknowingly this would be for the last time, on the 12th of June, when someone, somewhere in Allied intel, became convinced that the Kriegsmarine had somehow slipped a large contingent out into the Atlantic with the intention of reinforcing the Regia Marina in the Mediterranean, which thus would mean they'd have to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar. With the war on land going less than optimally, this seemed like an excellent chance to strike back, and soon 24 French warships were heading at speed for an interception. Aerial reconnaissance reported a large force of ships had been spotted heading for Gibraltar, interpreted as a Regia Marina formation trying to meet up with the Germans, and so the fleet increased its rate of advance to 24 knots, even if this risked leaving the Britannias somewhat behind. Unfortunately, it turned out that the initial intelligence about a German formation was completely wrong, and the reconnaissance aircraft had in fact spotted the French force and misidentified it as an enemy formation, which meant that in these past few days of excitement, what they'd actually been doing was chasing themselves. Dubbing the whole incident something that roughly translates to Battle of the Mirrors, the French ships returned to their various ports. But back on land, the French government had changed, and what would become known as the Vichy government was negotiating an armistice with the Germans. That, in turn, set into motion a series of events which would soon lead to Admiral Somerville's forces appearing off Mers el-Kebir, with strict orders to prevent the French forces potentially falling into German or Italian hands. And that, of course, would be the start of Operation Catapult, which would culminate in the attack on Mers el Kabir, which is of course a separate video, but which also brought to an end the brief existence of the forced raid.